Life brings us trials that leave us questioning, why is this happening? Sometimes it doesn't seem like there's an answer in this life. At other times, well, it seems like there is an answer. We have done it to ourselves. Our sinful choices have brought something upon ourselves and have led us to somewhere we don't want to be, but we understand that's our fault. Even if that's the case in any storm that you are enduring, whether it is sudden or self-inflicted, God is there. And God is there to instruct, to guide, to teach, and even to deliver with his sovereign hand if it is his will. This is something that we're going to be considering with the book of Daniel. The people of God are in a storm. And they don't need to be asking, why is this happening? Because they have brought it upon themselves. God has been warning them for generations that this is coming. God gave them an example that it is coming. And yet they had not repented and turned to the Lord. And so God brought oppression through a foreign king. As we consider that, we are also considering this. God is in control. God can bring this punishment. And if God can bring it, God can end it as well. His hand is sovereign over these events. He is in control. Nothing escapes his purpose. Not a nation, not a king, not anything within the course of history. He controls it all. He directs it all. He declares the end from the beginning. Now tonight, we are beginning a series in the book of Daniel. We are going to be studying it verse by verse as well as we can. And we are calling that series Daniel, God's Sovereign Plans. Because God does have sovereign plans. God is over all, and his will not fail or falter. His plans will not come to nothing. They will come to fruition. He will bring about the majesty of his kingdom, and he will have his supreme authority known on this earth. He has made it known before, and he will make it known again. Well, the verses we've read just from Daniel chapter 2 to give us a little flavor of what we're getting into here, capture the heart of this message, the message that is central to the book of Daniel. And it's a truth that brings hope to his people who are in exile at that point, and to his people who are facing various storms today. Now, before we dive into the text of this book, we need to set the stage. We're not going to get very far this evening because the book of Daniel has so many profound truths. In fact, it's also a blend of history, of prophecy, of theology. And of course, it's written in one of Israel's darkest periods. To fully appreciate its message, we will spend this sermon just introducing the book. We're just getting the facts of the book before us, before we really start digging into the text. We want to know the historical context of this book. We want to understand its authorship. We want to understand its purpose. And we want to understand its unique features. We're going to get into all that, as well as some challenges that might be before us in the text. And so let's begin by first understanding the world of Daniel. And some of that I've already done ahead of time. I do have some papers back there. Some of you have noticed. Others may not have noticed, but these papers have some dates on them and some some chapters that align with those dates in the book of Daniel, and give you a timeline of Daniel's life with all of this. So you understand how old he is as he's going through each of these things. Daniel lived through the entire 70-year exile, and he recorded God's revelations in this book afterward. And so the book of Daniel, as we consider all of this, the book of Daniel is likely composed between 536 and 530 BC, before Christ. Now, remember, any date BC, before Christ, counts down. And so sometimes that is a little confusing as you're looking at that. But the lower the date, the smaller the number, I should say, the later in history it is, or the closer to Christ it is. And so that's why it counts down to BC like that. Now, this would have been shortly after the events described in Daniel chapter, well, you might think the end of the book, Daniel 12, no. Daniel 11, nope. Daniel 10 is actually the final events that are listed there. And then it's followed up by some prophecies. And so that would have been about the year 536 BC. So 536 years before Christ, we would call that the 6th century BC. The 6th century BC. Now, this dating aligns with the historical timeline of the Babylonian captivity. And that is what Daniel is experiencing. Why is he taken from his home? Why is he in Babylon? He is a part of the Babylonian captivity. And that spanned from the year 605 BC to, guess what, 536 BC. And so Daniel's life spanned that captivity. Now, that's a 6th century date for this book, 6th century BC date for this book. And that's the traditional one that both Jews and Christians have seen. But of course, there are always people who disagree. There are people who think, well, that may be the traditional date, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right one. And so people come in later with better ideas, at least to them. And these are critical scholars. They propose a date that is actually centuries later. They think that it was written around the year 165 BC. Now, that's quite a bit later. That's the 2nd century BC versus the 6th century BC. Why do they think it's so much later? That's only 165, maybe 150 years before Christ, depending on the date that's given. Well, what we will see as we're digging into this book is that Daniel makes incredibly accurate predictions of events that will happen during what is known as the intertestamental period. You say, what in the world is that? That is a $10 word. Yep, and I had to practice it many times before I could say it without stumbling over it. What does that word mean? Well, if you were to turn to the book of Malachi, that is the last book, at least in our Old Testament. And then the next page, well, on my Bible, it says the New Testament, because that's the New Testament. And then we get to Matthew. There is a little bit of a gap there of, well, centuries that are between the testaments, that are intertestamental. That's where that word comes from. And so these scholars say, okay, there is no way that Daniel, writing in the 6th century BC, could accurately predict events that are happening right before Christ. And so what must be happening is that we have actually not a 6th century writer, but a 2nd century writer who is writing these things down, this history down. But what he's doing is, with a little wink and a nudge, writing them down like it's prophecy. And like, oh yeah, look, God predicts this is going to happen. And It did happen. And so during this period, you had the rise of the Grecian Empire, um, Alexander the Great, of course, going and conquering. And then you have the dissolution of his empire, the four generals. Then you had the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes. Oh, we're going to talk about that guy uh, once we get there. Not a good guy. But these scholars suggest that it's actually a second century writer just saying, yeah, this is what's happened recently. And oh, yeah, Daniel predicted it. Daniel, this guy who lived hundreds of years ago, but this book actually was written in the second century. Why do people do that? Well, they assume that the supernatural is impossible. That's really what this comes from. People assume that the supernatural is impossible. You can't tell me that someone writing can accurately predict the future because the supernatural can't happen. Ergo, there must be another explanation for this. Now, why do people have an allergy to the supernatural? There might be several reasons, but I think it all comes down to this: it's to avoid accountability to the God of Scripture. I think that's what it really comes down to. Because if God can accurately predict through Daniel events that happen hundreds of years later, then what's written there in the text is supernatural and it should be listened to. No, no, no. Let's go with the natural explanation because we don't want that. But we still have to ask ourselves, how do we know which date is right? Because it's possible someone's pulled the wool over our eyes, I suppose. And so how do we determine what's right? Well, we begin looking like at anything else with the internal evidence, for instance. We might look at things like linguistics that Daniel used. And when we look at his Hebrew, for instance, his Hebrew represents 6th century Hebrew. How do we know that? Because we can compare it to writings like Ezekiel. And it looks just like how Ezekiel wrote in Hebrew. Language changes over time. And so you can kind of take a look at the language and determine, okay, is this early or late Hebrew? What kind of Hebrew is this? But he didn't just write in Hebrew, he also wrote in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the day, the language of commerce. And his Aramaic matches a papyri that we found in the 5th century. And so his writing is right there in that time period. It doesn't seem like a much later 2nd century writer pretending to be someone from an older time. Moreover, this book is included in the Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint. The Septuagint was translated in the 3rd century BC, which is the year 250, actually. So it's kind of hard to claim that this was invented in the 2nd century when it exists in a 3rd century document, which comes earlier. Now, as I said, his writing matches Ezekiel. Believe it or not, Ezekiel mentions Daniel. Of course, you should believe it. If you've read through Ezekiel, you might remember in Ezekiel 14, he mentions Daniel. Ezekiel 28, he mentions Daniel. Daniel was someone who lived at that point. And perhaps more importantly to some people, that is, Jesus Christ affirms that Daniel wrote this prophecy. He did so in Matthew 24:15. And his word should be enough. And if his word's not enough, if you say, well, yeah, Jesus believed that, but that doesn't mean it's true, well, then you have a bigger problem than when the book of Daniel was written. You need to learn a little bit more about Jesus. But as believers, we should trust Daniel's prophecy is divinely inspired and that it is pointing to a God who knows and controls the future. Now, that gives us just a start of understanding what was going on when this was written. Now, this is a little bit more information than you had wanted, possibly, but I'll also refer you to those sheets because we need to understand what was happening at that time. what was happening in the 6th and even into the 7th century BC. Let's dig into the historical setting for a moment. The events in Daniel unfold against the backdrop of Judah's fall to Babylon. Remember, you had Israel split between the godly Israelites to the south and the Yankees to the north. And the Israelites to the north were taken away by Assyria. Judah began to wane in its own power and as well as its own spiritual condition. And concurrent with that, you see the rise of the Babylonians. And it's actually in the year 626 BC that you have Nebuchadnezzar arising and establishing the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And he executes an impressive win against the Assyrians. He overthrows the Assyrian Empire in 612 BC. Now that's getting us close to that time that we were just mentioning. Babylon, as they are dealing with issues over there, Babylon is seeing Judah, and it is seeing Judah as a potential threat to power. And so in the year 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar made Jehoiakim a vassal of the Babylonian state or the Babylonian Empire, and he raided Jerusalem. This was the first of multiple raids. There's going to actually be 3 big raids that happen. And I'm not even so sure that it was only 3 big raids that happened. There may have been smaller ones, but important to us are 3 of them. And among the captives that were taken in this first raid were some young men. Daniel and 3 of his friends who were born to nobility, apparently. Now, Nebuchadnezzar would not stop there. As I said, there would be other raids. There would be a subsequent large raid in the year 597, where he put out the king's eyes. And he took him blind back to Babylon. And of course, that was predicted by God as well. But he didn't just take him, he took 30,000 others captive, including Ezekiel. And so Ezekiel was taken in that second raid on Jerusalem. And then a third raid comes in the year 586 BC. And this third raid would be a final raid because Jerusalem would be destroyed. By the way, the book of Lamentations will be written in the midst of Jerusalem's destruction. That would complete Judah's subjugation. And that was the Babylonian captivity. The people of God brought it upon themselves by continuing to turn away from God. And God said it was coming. And God delivered them over to this pagan nation. Yet even in the midst of this, we see something shining through. For instance, we see Daniel's life testifying to God's faithfulness in the midst of this. And speaking of Daniel, that brings us to a question that a lot of people would ask at this point. Who wrote this book? Well, Daniel wrote this book, of course. And I could say that's enough and move on, but of course I'm going to dig into that a little bit. The book claims to be written by Daniel. Daniel chapter 12, verse 4 actually says something to that order where Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress. So he's being addressed there. You get down to verse 4. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. And so we see that being affirmed there, Starting in Daniel chapter 7, we start to notice the first person singular pronoun being used a lot, I and my. Who's I? Who's my? Well, that's Daniel. He's referring to himself there. Daniel's name means God is my judge. Whenever you have a name that ends with L, E-L, that is always a reference to God, the shortening of Elohim. Here we see it as God is my judge. He was a well-educated Jew, became well-educated, of course, in Babylon with linguistics, with cultural expertise, and he had all that he needed to be able to produce a work of this magnitude. Of course, he did so under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but his Hebrew and Aramaic align with 6th century styles, as we've mentioned, not with later periods, and that supports his authorship. Now, this Daniel is the Daniel who lived through those tumultuous decades that we were just mentioning with the raids on Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And we might wonder, how is someone who is snatched from his home as a young man going to live in a culture like that, under a king like that? Well, we're going to see just how he does it in chapter 1. But he is snatched up as a teenager. He is renamed Belshazzar, which is actually a pagan name. So his Hebrew name is taken. He's given a pagan name that honors a pagan god, and he is being trained to serve a pagan empire. And yet, in the midst of this, we see God blessing him. He arises to prominence as a statesman as well as a prophet. And he, over the course of his lifetime, influences kings, not just Nebuchadnezzar, but also down to Darius and Cyrus. His story reminds us that God works through his servants, and sometimes he does so in great and marvelous ways. Even in hostile environments, he works to accomplish his purposes. So Daniel served in Babylon, and he did so, as I said, until 536, and Cyrus issued that decree to allow the Jews to return. Now, I noted he is a statesman, he's also a prophet. And he recorded God's word to the exiles, but not just to them, but also to future generations, to God's people even today. What was he writing about? What was the message? Well, that brings me to the next question here. What is the book of Daniel about? What is the book of Daniel about? Well, Daniel writes to encourage the exiled Jews who are there by revealing God's sovereign plan for them during and after the Babylonian captivity, or after what we might call in Luke 21:24, what Jesus called the times of the Gentiles. This book tracks all of human history. And it demonstrates that despite Babylon's apparent victory, God remains in control. God will send other empires. Babylon would fall. And then eventually he would establish his eternal kingdom. In Daniel 2:44, that's what we were just reading about, right? Verse 44 again. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. So there is a plan. And God wants his people to know that. And so he sends Daniel, and Daniel reveals that plan to his people. And this plan not only spoke to them, but also, again, to future generations. It gives us an Old Testament glimpse of the end times, which is akin to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. These two books are companions to one another. Now, there are key themes throughout this book that we will be considering. For instance, we will consider God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty, his reign. He is king and he is in control. And we will see through Daniel chapters 2 through 11 that God rules over all nations and kings. He appoints the times and the seasons. He draws boundaries. And he brings down those he wishes to. God is sovereign. We will also be considering Israel's subjugation. We've already been talking about that. Chapter 1, especially the first couple of verses there, we see that just pointedly. And we'll get more into but we can read those two verses. In the third king of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave, look at that, the Lord delivered over Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, that would be to Babylon, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. It looks like Babylon won. Israel is certainly under subjection. And we'll talk more about that again next time. But we'll also see that there is going to be a restoration for Israel. Israel will not remain under subjection forever. This is what God has planned. God delivered Jehoiakim over to Babylon, over to Nebuchadnezzar. And God will at one point say, and we're done. He chastises those he loves. He disciplines those he loves. Sometimes we have to endure. And that is going to be another theme that we see in the book of Daniel. We'll also see the progression of kingdoms. Daniel chapter 2, we see that revealed. Daniel chapter 7, we will see kingdoms rise and fall. We'll see empires. And these are all Gentiles, Gentile nations that come up. And we'll see the rise of not only of the Babylonians, but then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. And of course, with the Romans come Jesus, right? All of this was predicted in Daniel. We'll also see another theme in this book, and that's the pride of kings. The pride of kings. Human rulers who think they are at the height of power find themselves humbled before the God who is over all. Daniel 2 through 5, 7 and 8, 11, we will see that. Nebuchadnezzar sees that, experiences that in a very, very intimate way, and he is changed by it, I think. Then we will note, of course, God's eternal kingdom in this book. God's eternal kingdom, which we've already been mentioning. What we haven't mentioned, though, is that this is going to be the Messiah's kingdom, the Messianic kingdom. And with the rise of the Messiah, we will then begin to consider, okay, are we in that kingdom now, or is that kingdom still to come? We are definitely citizens of that kingdom. we'll begin to see that there may be a future aspect to this kingdom. We are still before that kingdom, that we are pre-millennial. And we will get into what that means as we are going into this. Now, these are just a few things that the book of Daniel is about. There's a lot more that we could talk about, but ultimately, this is a book of destiny, a destiny that God writes. And to remind us of this, again, we're subtitling this series through Daniel, God's Sovereign Plans. It not only helps us to understand Israel's history, but it helps us to understand that there is a future that God has planned for the rest of the world. This time of the Gentiles will eventually come to an end. Now, what makes this book different than other books of the Old Testament? Maybe even other books of the New Testament? Well, let's consider that next. The characteristics of this book, what makes this book unique. Well, in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Daniel, and this may surprise you, because you think, okay, all these prophecies, we see these visions of beasts, and their dreams, and there's all this stuff happening. We might think, okay, this is a book of the prophets, and of course, in our Bibles, it is included in the prophets, but in the Hebrew Bible, it's not. It's included in the writings. Now, Daniel obviously was a prophet, but he was also a leader. And he was dealing with the affairs of state of his day. So just like with Ruth and other books, we are seeing a book that is recording history as well as giving some prophecy, although this book obviously is a lot heavier on the prophecy. But that's perhaps why it appears where it does in the Hebrew Bible. Now, this book does have prophecy, as I said. It's very unique in its prophecy. It's apocalyptic in its style. Very much like the book of Revelation, where we see lots of signs and images that require interpretation. As one commentary notes, 9 of the 12 chapters relate to revelation through dreams/visions. What Revelation is to the New Testament prophetically and apocalyptically, Daniel is to the Old Testament. And so again, these are companion books. And many have struggled with the exact meanings of these visions, just as many have struggled with the meanings of the prophecies in the book of Revelation. But they are there for our edification, they are there for our blessing, and we will seek to understand them. It is clear that in some way they do predict the future. Another thing that's unique about this book that I've mentioned just in passing is that it's a bilingual book. A bilingual book. That is unique indeed. Like other books of the Old Testament, yes, it does have Hebrew, which is in chapters 1 and then chapters 8 through 12, but it also contains Aramaic, that language of the day that other people spoke, chapters 2 through 7. Now, with the words of language of commerce, that means that this book has a dual audience. It is written both to Jews and to Gentiles. It's not just to one, it is also to the other. So there is something here to consider, even in the Old Testament, with words to the Gentile nations which extend on into history, well beyond Daniel's day. Now, as we consider all this and we consider these key thoughts, we'll also see that this is a book that points toward the Messiah, toward the Son of Man, as he is called in chapter 7 of the book of Daniel here. That is something that Jesus commonly calls himself in the Gospels. Have you ever wondered that? Why does he always call himself the Son of Man? It's like, I mean, if you think that that's just a term that's synonymous with human, don't you think that would be weird to say? Yes, the human must do this. What is he saying? Why is he referring to himself in that way? No, he is referring to himself to point out the fact that he is a fulfillment of prophecy. He is a fulfillment of Daniel. He is the Son of Man who is given everlasting dominion from the Ancient of Days. Look to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Daniel 7, 13 and 14. Daniel says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. The everlasting kingdom that we read about in chapter 2, verse 44, is the kingdom of the Messiah. And of course, that becomes clear in other places of the book as well. But Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, so you understand he is the one who has the everlasting kingdom from the Father, from the Ancient of Days. We'll also see the vision of the 69 weeks in chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. The 69 weeks, we'll talk about this in just a minute, how they pinpoint the Messiah and his triumphal entry. We'll also see the Old Testament reference to the resurrection. Take a look at chapter 12. Chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I started to read this a minute ago, and then I realized I was getting ahead of myself, or I was getting ahead of myself here. Michael is standing there, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, that would be the Jews, everyone who is found written in the book will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. Oh, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Oh. So there will be a resurrection of the dead that is coming. And some, for those who are written in the book, which book? The Lamb's Book of Life. They will be raised to everlasting life. But those who have been raised who are not written in the book will be judged according to their works, and they will be condemned to everlasting contempt. We see all of this. We see this prediction. We see the visions of the beast and of the angels. But it is all God's holy revelation, all of this. So this is a book of depth. This is a book that is challenging in many ways, but it is a book that is worth the challenge. And with that said, there are going to be problems interpreting this book, especially with certain passages. When we approach those, sometimes they are referred to in commentaries as interpretive issues, which is a very fancy way of saying there's going to be a lot of debate here. There's going to be a lot of fighting here. We need to figure it out, though. We got to duke it out to figure out what the right way of reading it is. And that actually brings me to the last point. What problems might we encounter in this book? Well, we've already noted one of the major issues. How do we handle the nature of the prophecies which are found in this book? Why do I say that? Because there are skeptics who are generally unwilling to accept the supernatural aspects of this book. Those who say the prophecy in this book is just a little too perfect. I once had someone tell me that. It's just too nice a bow on top. So, well, if God ties a bow, it's going to be a pretty nice bow, right? No, it's just a little too perfect for me. Just a little too perfect for me. They don't want to live in a world of supernatural revelation. So they date the book much later. But as we've seen, the evidence is that the book is true, meaning that skeptics must acknowledge the evidence that not only this book is genuine, but that it is revelation from God, that we need to deal with that. We need to find which revelation we might be, or which resurrection we might be raised to, whether it be a resurrection of life or a resurrection of death. We need to know which one we're a part of. And that is something that we will deal with, and obviously we're dealing with it by believing that this is supernatural and that this is a word from God. Another issue is not with skeptics, but with our fellow brothers and sisters in the faith. How do we interpret the book? Some of the prophecies need to be interpreted not on the basis of whether or not they're supernatural, but whether or not they speak of something that is past from our perspective or still future. Now, dispensationalists like John MacArthur, like myself, would view Daniel's prophecies, just to tip my hand a little bit of where I'm going with this, they view Daniel's prophecies as divinely inspired predictions that outline God's plan for Israel and for the nations, culminating in a premillennial kingdom. And we'll note just two significant interpretive issues as we highlight the importance of a literal hermeneutic to uphold the text's eschatological promises, its end time promises. Others who take different end times views than ourselves, again, brothers and sisters, we don't want to shun people, we don't want to consign people to hell just because they take a slightly different view than we do on some of this stuff, but they will use a different hermeneutical principle when they get to these passages, and you can see it as they do it. For instance, Daniel chapter 9, and we'll really dig into this once we get there, but I just want to give you a flavor of where we're moving with all this. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27 is a pivotal prophecy. You can see it begins there that 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and for your holy city. Earlier I said 69 weeks, and I'm going to explain that here in just a moment. But what are the 70 weeks? To finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, that would be until Christ, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 62. I'll start with 62, 63, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Ah, there we go. There's the 69 weeks right there. That's not the height of my mathematical abilities, but it gets pretty close to there. Then after the 62 weeks, that would be the 62 plus the 7, of course. That would be the 69 weeks. The Messiah will be cut off. Oh, okay. So after the 69 weeks, Jesus was crucified, right? The Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the city. Wait a minute. None of that happened, though, with Jesus' death. Well, later, though, it did, right? There was a gap of time. And later on, people did come in and destroy the city and sanctuary. That happened in the year 70, or AD 70, in the year of our Lord. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. And I will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. Again, that's 1 week of 7 years. But in the middle of that week, he will put a stop to sacrifices and grain offerings. So that's at the 3.5 year mark. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Now, there's a lot to consider with that. We do know that as if we interpret this on a literal timeline of 490 years, we can start with the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, which is in Nehemiah chapter 2. That was in 444 BC. And we add 69 weeks, or 483 years, we arrive at the Messiah's triumphal entry at the year 33. Okay, so if that's the literal way that we interpret this, well, then we should be thinking, well, what is a literal interpretation of the final week, the 70th week? Well, it seems like there will be a 7-year period of desolations, of tribulation. Now that's how a dispensationalist reads this. Again, others will view this symbolically. They will say this doesn't quite apply that way. But we'll get into that when we get there. But I do think that this is talking about a distinct role, or it maintains that distinct role of Israel in God's redemptive plan, and it culminates in the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. And that's the way that we are moving with all of this. Now, who is that prince that is to come? Well, that is an interpretive issue, and I think it's linked to the interpretive issue of who is the little horn in Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 8, there's these beasts, and we read about horns, and then we read about this little horn. Again, dispensational scholars identify this as the Antichrist. This is a figure prefigured by Antiochus Epiphanes. This is a man in history. He is an heir of sorts. He thinks he is the heir of the Grecian Empire, of Alexander's empire. He calls himself a god at some point. What dispensationalists do is they look to this man and they say he is a type. The archetype, the future fulfillment is going to be the Antichrist. What we see in Antiochus Epiphanes is what we will see in this future prince, in the little horn. And of course, we'll talk about that when we get there. We'll see how this parallels the tribulation period and then Christ's return. And again, of course, people see this differently depending on where they are. But I think what we need to do is make sure that we are establishing a consistent hermeneutic. And the same hermeneutic, the same way we read the text, starting in Daniel chapter 1, should be the same way we read the text as we get through all the way to Daniel chapter 12. We need to interpret it as it's written. And of course, we need to interpret it within the context of the rest of Scripture. Now, this is just a bit of the kind of material that we are going to be discussing in this book. There's a lot here. And some of this, we're going to be getting into some pretty deep stuff, some end-time stuff that may sometimes people get a little weird about it. But I hope that you'll see something above all of this. It's this, that God rules over history. God is in control. God has a sovereign plan. And God will bring about that plan. As we see this, Hopefully, this anchors us and it motivates us to live faithfully for Christ. So, wrapping this up here, as we begin our journey through the book of Daniel, I hope that we will anchor our hearts in the truth of God's sovereignty. Now, whether you are facing trials or going through something, even if it's self-inflicted, I hope that you will see that these things happen in your life because of God's purposes. And God has a purpose not just for you, but for the whole world. God is over all. He is over the rulers. He is over the nations. He is over history itself. And his wisdom and power can sustain us throughout anything because he is in control. He is over all. As we rest our hearts in that, we also can know this, that his revelation, and this is his revelation, y'all, it will guide us. And his kingdom can assure us of ultimate victory. Ultimate victory. So whether you're facing personal trials, maybe you're concerned about global uncertainties, well, rest in the God who holds all things in his hand.